Now that you've discovered what are the key pieces of transition that you need to make from your HTML4 and XHTML to HTML5, I want to talk about some notable changes to HTML4 features that are now different in HTML5. These fall into three categories. The first is semantic refinements and recastings. Some of the elements they're used to working with now have better defined semantics, more precise semantics, and some of the elements that you may not be using very much have been recast to be more semantic and to actually have meaning. There are various bits and pieces of black sheep in the world of markup that HTML5 is actually finally acknowledging. Some of these were in the specification in HTML4, and some were never in any HTML specification and are actually being introduced officially into HTML5 after being neglected for so many years. Finally, there's some parts of HTML5 that actually break what we've been doing with the web with semantic markup as well. And in particular, the site element. I'm going to teach you about what HTML5 has done so far to date to the site element and what you can do to work around it. So let's talk about those semantic refinements. There's just a couple of them actually that you need to really pay attention to. The first is the M element. What you can now do officially is actually nest them to indicate stronger emphasis. So in cases where you may already be emphasizing something, like when you're quoting someone, you want to emphasize it really strongly, and then you want to emphasize something that they say even stronger than that. Here's where you would use a nested M element. Instead of, in the past, you would use a strong element. And that brings us to the next semantic refinement, which is the strong element has been refined or perhaps even redefined to mean importance rather than emphasis. This is a subtle but important distinction. You'll find that as you start using these elements in this new way, you'll slowly get used to their new meanings. Fortunately, these meanings are not connected to their styling, right? You can style emphasis and strong however you like in your CSS. So keep that in mind. In addition to the semantic refinements that HTML5 brings, there are several elements that HTML5 actually semantically recasts as being meaningful that used to be presentational. The first of those is a small element, which typically has been used as a counterpart to big, but has been recast to mean anything that's small print, which in this case means, from a meaning perspective, disclaimers, caveats, copyrights, all of those kinds of markup or content that you put in your page, you can now mark up with a small element to indicate that semantically it's something that has a little bit of a lighter voice, probably going to be presented differently, oftentimes smaller if it's a visual medium. But in other mediums now, you can take advantage of these semantics and style it accordingly as well. The second is the I element. And you're thinking, wait a minute, I means italics. How could you possibly redefine that to mean something semantic? Well, it turns out that if you look at typography, if you look at various manuals of style, italics are used in a number of different very semantic situations that don't actually have their own markup. So in HTML5, the I element is redefined to mean an alternate voice or mood, or perhaps a technical term, like a taxonomy, or the name of a species, or an idiom. These are all often enough used that HTML5 redefined the I element to mean this semantic, which you can now use. Of course, don't let that make you think that I just means italic anymore. Go ahead and use CSS to style it however you want. B tag has been similarly redefined, recast, to mean stylistically offset text. You may be wondering, well, what are instances of that? Sometimes keywords or product names or lead paragraphs are often stylistically offset from the rest of their content. And this is now the example of cases that you can actually use the B tag semantically. And I'm going to give you an example now, a real-world example that I actually happened across myself, which is the title of this work itself. And if we take a look at that, HTML5 now, a step-by-step video tutorial for getting started today, if we want to code that up, in addition to, of course, typing in the usual document header, right, with our meta-char set and doc type, then we type up the text first. Always I recommend HTML5 now, a step-by-step video tutorial for getting started today. Then it's clear that even from our HTML4 semantic knowledge, the HTML5 now is an H1, right? And a step-by-step video tutorial is a nice H2 subhead. And here is where we're going to start bringing in some of these new semantic refinements and recastings. If we take a look, the first thing we notice that's most obvious is that the word HTML5 and the word today are both stylistically offset. Now, I didn't read those in a different voice, or I didn't emphasize them at all, but they are different in the presentation. In this case, we find a perfect example of when you would use the B tag. So we mark up the HTML5 with B, as well as today with B. Make sure you get your close tags to balance your start tags. The next thing you might notice is that the number 5 is larger here. And I even spoke it with a stronger, more important level of emphasis. Now you might say, well, it was emphasized, but what's going on there is I'm saying that the number 5 is important. And that is a good example of when you would use the new semantically refined strong element. So we go ahead and mark up the 5 as being strong, because that's important. That's what we're talking about. The piece that I did emphasize was the word now. And that's really what we're talking about. We're not just talking about HTML5, we're emphasizing that you should get started with HTML5 now. And so that's a clear case of where we want to use the M element. Now, if we take a look at this, we've made use of the new B tag, the semantically refined strong tag, and the semantically refined M tag, all in one example. Let's move on to the next elements that have been semantically recast. The BR tag, which simply meant a line break, now has been formalized to actually mean that it implies semantics of a line break, whether in spoken form or in visual form. For example, poems, addresses. Line breaks here actually have a meaning, and so if you want to preserve that meaning, this is how you now do it. Similarly, the HR tag has often just meant, oh, well, it's just a horizontal rule, it's something that's just presentational. However, it's used often enough, such as in books, to mean a thematic break between paragraphs, that's what it's now defined to mean. Of course, it could have a presentation of being a horizontal rule, or perhaps you could change the presentation of the HR and replace it with a nice little background image of a little flourish, whatever makes sense for your content. If there aren't any places where you have thematic breaks between paragraphs, that's okay. You don't need to use it, but it's there now if you want to. In this next section, I'm going to discuss some of the pieces of markup that were either in HTML4 and deprecated, mistakenly, as it turns out, or some pieces that were never actually picked up and incorporated in any specs at all. In particular, these features all worked cross-browser. And when I say worked, I mean good enough that people coded with them, put on their websites, didn't actually have to do any kind of sniffing or anything, just use them day in, day out. Either they didn't make it into the spec, or they got deprecated mistakenly. In some cases, people came to the wrong conclusion. That's okay. We all make mistakes, even spec writers, and it's good to acknowledge those mistakes and fix them. So the first one is iframe. Now, you might be wondering, well, why didn't I just use object? Well, it turns out that there's enough of a difference in the way that objects are treated. They're almost always external plugins or applets from a permissions model and a security model that it makes sense to keep the iframe as having this special meaning of like, yes, it's like an object, but we're saying it's just embedded HTML. It has a very different implication, just like saying something is an image has a different implication than just saying it's an object. So the iframe is now valid HTML5 markup. This is a big one. HTML5 finally acknowledges that plugins deserve a tag that works cross-browser and works predictably and works well. The embed tag, which most websites today seem to use to embed either Flash or QuickTime, sometimes other plugins, is now a valid part of HTML5. And the nice thing is that HTML5 defines how authors should use it and defines how browsers should implement it so that any small discrepancies they may have had can now be worked out and we can just author consistently. The target attribute is one that was hotly debated because it was often seen as something presentational. Not only that, it was seen as something that was actually bad for the user interface because, well, no one likes pop-up windows, right? Well, it turns out that most of those annoying pop-up windows don't come from the target attribute, but rather come from JavaScript. So the target attribute itself indicating the semantic that, yes, I want the destination of this link to actually load in a separate window or in a separate iframe, for example, which we just acknowledged was valid, is now accepted in HTML5. So that means you can use it as part of the base tag or the A tag or the area tag. All these forms of hyperlinking now can direct their documents at a specific destination. The last set of HTML5 black sheep that have now been acknowledged is that of list numbering. The value attribute on the list element was deprecated mistakenly in HTML4. It was assumed to be presentational, but it turns out that for various applications, legal applications, perhaps you're displaying a list 10 items at a time across different pages, the value attribute is quite useful and should never have been deprecated. So now it's in HTML5. Parallel to the value attribute, the start attribute on an ordered list element. So sometimes you start a list from number 1, right? But oftentimes, like I said with pagination, if you're going to the second page of a list of 100 items that you're displaying 10 at a time, you need your list to start at number 11, right? So this is where you use the ordered list start attribute, say start equals 11, and then you can move on from there. It's an accepted part of HTML5. Another thing that we've seen in the past 10 years is this incredible amount of use of dynamic content in pages. And what dynamic content means is that sometimes a portion of a page just doesn't have anything to fill in. So you might have an ordered list of items or an unordered list of items that is completely dynamically generated. That is, has no content directly that's static or from the server without the user interacting. Fortunately now, instead of having to use a div for that, you can actually use a semantic list to indicate, hey, something's going to go here, but for now it's empty, and you can have 0 items in an ordered list or an unordered list. I figured I would slip in one new feature here for you guys, which is that ordered lists now can count backwards. I know you're thinking, well, what a big deal, right? Well, if you're posting a top 10 list, for example, now you can simply use the reverse attribute to start and the start attribute to start your list at 10 and count it down all the way to 1. This brings us to the last notable change from HTML4 to HTML5, and that is some of the restrictions to the site element. In particular, what's happened is, well, in HTML4, it provided 2 distinct uses of the site element. One was to cite various works, titles, like if you were to cite HTML5 now. Well, HTML4 also allowed cite to be used for speaker names. Not everything that you want to quote, for example, has a source in print that you can cite. Sometimes you're just quoting a speaker and you just put their name. This was used often. It's in HTML4 examples and it's all over the web. HTML5, unfortunately, has constrained the cite element, at least the current HTML5, to only the title of a work, and it explicitly disallowed the use for people that previously was allowed. Well, this is not something that everyone agrees with, and so I'm actually going to give you a recommendation here that works with HTML4 and works with, let's say, the spirit of HTML5, but not necessarily the letter right now, which is to use the cite element for speakers, but to mark them up with HCard microformat so that you can indicate this is a site for a person and not a site for a title or a work. Here's an example. A quote tag, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that was said by Alan Kay. I don't know if he actually said that in print anywhere, but as far as I know, he was the person that said it. So rather than omitting that semantic information, I'm using the cite element here with an HCard, it starts with class equals vcard, and a class of fn to indicate that that's his full name, his full formatted name, to indicate that this site is a speaker that's a person. I encourage you to do this, and this is what modern web designers have been doing for quite some time and will continue to do so. Not only modern web designers, but it turns out millions of real-world web pages actually use cite for speakers. What kind of web pages are citing all these speakers? Well, for example, blog comments. If you look at popular WordPress themes, they list all the blog comments. Every commenter is marked up with a cite because that's the semantically right thing to do. So what I encourage you to do is to add your voice. If you're a web designer or developer and in pursuing semantic markup, use these techniques. This is starting to get into the area where you can start contributing to HTML5. This is a wiki page on the What Working Group wiki, specifically about the cite element, documenting these kind of uses. The nice thing about HTML5 is it is still a bit in flux, and it's also based on gathering evidence. If we gather enough evidence, this is a part of the spec that we may be able to actually get changed. Maybe not in this version, maybe it'll be in a 5.01. We're not sure. In either case, contribute to the spec and help it evolve in a good direction. So, notable changes to HTML4. In summary, we have new specific semantic details with M and strong. M now means emphasis, you can nest it. Strong now means importance. The following elements that used to be purely presentational have been redefined to be semantic, which is a wonderful boon to all of us. Small, for small print, whether it's copyright, disclaimers, etc., things that often go in a footer, right? I, for taxonomic terms and other such sort of changes of voice in some text. The B tag is now used for stylistic offset text. BR, finally we can mark up our poetry properly and semantically, including line breaks where they were intended. And HR for thematic breaks between paragraphs. HTML5 accepts as now being okay the iframe and embed elements, as well as the value and start attributes for lists. Finally, HTML5 makes a little bit of a misstep here with the cite element, and to work around that, we recommend that when you're using the cite element for marking up speakers, use it with the HCard microformat so that you're clearly indicating, especially to browsers that support it and any other user agent or search engine that supports it, that you mean a person.